Okay. So GWAS study was started in about early 2000. This happened, basically, you need a human genome sequence. Especially, we need to know some existing SNPs. So, the very first human genome was sequenced in 2001, and then more human genome got sequenced. At least you see, oh, there are differences between, say, Caucasians and Asians, or like there are definitely some racial differences. But then with that, people started to, also microarray came around. People started to design these SNP arrays. In the very early days, they only look at 10,000 SNPs. And then they went to 100,000 SNPs, and later they went to like 1 million SNPs, so different SNP arrays. The arrays didn't end up costing more. They just managed to put more and more SNPs in the same array. And so people started doing a lot of these GWAS studies, and you can see the number of publications that are related to, that are GWAS studies continue to increase. Recently, I think it's kind of plateaued a little bit, but in the early years, there were a lot of such studies. Unfortunately, in early studies, most of the reported associations were not consistently reproduced. In the early days, people didn't know how many patients they have to profile. For example, they might say, we collected 50 individuals with the disease and 50 individuals without the disease, and they want to look at the SNP difference between them. And they found some SNPs that are significant. At that time, they also may or may not know that they have to check multiple hypothesis testing. They just got one SNP that has 10 to the minus 5, and they reported it. And then the next study picked another, say, 100 cases and 100 controls. They were, for the same disease. They do the same SNP profile and then association. They will find totally different SNPs from the first study. In fact, there was a 2002 paper showing that there are 603 associations of the reported in publications of reported association of polymorphism and particular disease. 166 studied in at least 3 populations. So, in 3 different studies or more, they were looking at the same disease association. And out of all of the 603, only 6 have been seen in over 75% of the studies. So most of these were not reproduced. Yeah, because in the early days, people just didn't know. And these are the 6. When they are repeatedly observed in multiple populations, it probably means it's real. And also, it probably indicates that their effect size is pretty big. Yeah, if you only have an effect like odds ratio of 1.02, it's unlikely that you will see it in another study. But if you have an effect size of, say, 1.8 or even 2, then you have much higher chance of seeing it repeatedly in other studies. So what is the cause of these problems? The first is size matters. So you might want to, you might have a GWAS study that at the end of the day give you a p-value. Like if you check all the SNPs in that study, and each SNP you do the chi-square test, it give you a p-value, right? And you look at the QQ plot of the expected p-value and the observed p-value, you might sometimes see something like this. In some of these studies, they still reported, the SNPs around here. It's the log, minus log p. Yeah, so they probably reported this one as a hit. This will have a very significant or small p-value, right? So the minus log p will be a big number. And so in this study, basically, they probably just reported one high p-value result, and they say, okay, we found one SNP. But then if you look at the QQ plot distribution, you will not know that this small p-value just happened by chance, right? Can you tell me, in this situation, if we were to draw a histogram of the p-value, what does that histogram look like? Yes. Uniform? Yes, it's a uniform distribution. Remember, in the real GWAS study, or any kind of a p-value calculation with multiple hypotheses, if your final distribution look like this, that's probably real. It means that most of the tests you are doing, they don't give you any significant p-value, but then there are some that appear more significant than expected. right? But if the whole thing, like this is flat, it means even the small p-value just happened by chance. Then it's not significant. Later on, there is a 2002 study showing in different GWAS studies, this is the sample size. The y-axis is how many GWAS SNPs they are able to identify. You can see there is a very, very good correlation. In the early days, well, this is already not too early. You can see that the smallest cohort still have over 2,000 individuals. Some of these, 2002 association studies, the 606, I bet none of them have over 2,000 individuals. It just be 50 or a few hundred, which is really not very good. But if you look at the later studies in general, when you have a big cohort, then yes, your chance of identifying some GWAS hits are much, much better. You can also identify more. This usually means you will be able to get a more significant p-value. The effect size is the same for the same SNP, right? It's just with a bigger population, you can estimate the effect size more accurately. It doesn't mean that you will get a more significant effect size. Okay, yeah, so effect size, you can imagine it's like a fold change. It's like a differential expression fold change, right? The more people you have, you might have more significant p-value. But it's like an unfair coin. How unfair it is, there's a probability you flip ahead. With more population, you have a better estimation of that probability, but you don't really change the coin effect, right? Yeah, so the sample size is very, very important. Ideally, if you look at a QQ plot, this is probably a good GWAS study. You do this and you see, most of these p-values lie on the QQ plot. And then a few spots show significance. And so these ones should be the ones that get reported as significant, right? There are also situations when after a GWAS study, when you look at the p-value distribution, you see something like this, and then something like a few dots on the above. And so if you were to use, standard Benjamini-Hochberg cutting, you will be able to cut a lot of genes as significant. Can you guess what happens when you see a QQ plot like this? Can you guess what happened there? So in a case control study, we hope that the case and controls have similar populations. Say they live in the same city, similar racial makeup, similar life habits, and lifestyle and things like that. But sometimes you may or may not be able to do this very well. For example, say a GWAS study on longevity might just pick those people who are centenarians. They live over 100 years, then you test their DNA. And you also test those individuals who died of natural causes. Well, I guess not necessarily, not like disease. They didn't die of accident, basically, like car crash or situation. So they die of either disease or some other natural causes earlier. And you look at their difference, or you can just even compare the centenarian with the general population, because I think most of us are not expected to live over 100 years. And you want to look at the difference. I'm, of course, just making up a situation. It could be that what you didn't know is that there's an overwhelming enrichment of Japanese in that centenarian population, whereas the general population you pick is the Boston area, right, which has probably higher Caucasian percentages. And so at the end, when you are comparing this, you end up just comparing more Asian population with Caucasian population. There will be a lot of SNPs that are different, not because it's related to aging at all, right? So this is called population stratification. For example, some of the SNPs might be unique to a specific ethnic group or a racial group. So we need to make sure that the sample groups in the case and control, we need to match them as much as possible. Sometimes there could be hidden environmental structures So you might pick, the case and control that have, different disease frequency, different allele frequency. Yeah, so for example, these are the case, and this is the control. And because there are some, different population differences. Yeah, so these are the same population, like say, in this situation, say this population is the, say, Japanese population. This is the kind of the greater Boston population, which has more Caucasians, right? But then it turns out that the Japanese population has more centenarians. And so what you are actually comparing at the end is the Caucasian versus Asian difference, not necessarily related to the disease. Yeah, so the association just picks up the fact that more people in the one population is in the case or in the control. Okay, so in these type of GWAS studies, sometimes when people see this, they just adjust the curve completely. You scale by a factor. Basically, this will now be the kind of the QQ plot null curve. And so you will only report the top 5 in this case as significant SNPs. Okay. There are other potential, so one way to detect this type of population stratification is by doing principal component analysis on all the SNPs that you see. Remember in the GWAS study, for every allele you have, either the big A's, two big A's, one big A, small a, or the 2 small A's. And so across all the SNPs, you can read out the genotype. But if you look at all the case and controls in your study, you put them in a principal component analysis, it doesn't matter whether you have population stratification. If you just take any, take all Harvard students, for example, you do their genotyping and you run a PCA, you won't find a situation like this, right? So this is a African population. They are actually the most different from everybody else. And then there's the American, which is close to the Oceania, and also they are close to the East Asian group. Yeah, so there's some, the hypothesis is that the Asian people walk across the Bering Sea to go to America. So these, basically Native Americans and Asians are kind of similar. And then you have pretty much the European population and also some Middle East, you can see, and Central Asia. So these are kind of population differences. So when you have this situation, you want to make sure that either you only pick one type of population or at least your case control, the population is similar. If in a case you see they are mostly here and the control you see mostly there, then this study is completely confounded. Then you can't really see the GWAS association. So the first is population stratification. The second situation is something called identity by descent, which means that you have, say, siblings or cousins or relatives that are too close to each other in a particular case control studies. For the family-based study, you really just want big families or trios or even bigger families. But when you do case control, you need the individual to be as unrelated as possible, right? So if 2 individuals, you can imagine this is to say the dad and the mom and the child, this is the, and so for example, these 2 are siblings and these 2 are cousins. If you look at their DNA, because the 2 cousins did inherit one of the copy from a completely unrelated parent, but the other copy of their chromosome is more or less related because their respective parents are siblings, right? And so if you look at their DNA sequence, there will be big chunks that looks the same between the 2 cousins in here. And the IBD test is just looking across the genome SNP by SNP to see how similar they are across stretches of SNPs. And so the IBD test can give you between 0 and 1 evaluation. So in a GWAS study, we might want to do pairwise IBD to look at, you know, the similarity between the two samples. And so if the probability of two individuals, if the IBD is 0, it means that they are not related. In fact, if you are 3 generations away, then they are as bad as completely random people. But if you are like 2 generations, like uncles and great uncles, then you might see some similarities. Let's see. Yeah, the probability of 2 individuals to share 0, 1, or 2 haplotype across all the genome, you can see. So Z0 and Z1 and Z2. Yeah. So in this case, yeah. So if you have a twin, they are completely the same. They are completely identical. And so the probability that they share the same, let's see. Yeah, it's a very, very significant p-value in here that they share the same thing. And so usually in a case control study, you do not want to have any twins. In this situation, you will take one of the twin out and throw them out of the study. There are also cases when you have a parent offspring. So what happens with parent offspring is one copy of their chromosome is the same as the parent. The other copy is from the mom, or you know, the other parent. So you can see is one copy is 1, the other copy is 0. These ones are siblings. Yeah, they share some of the things different, but because of recombination, they are not the same. And so I guess for siblings, you probably also just want to keep one out of the 2 siblings. And then these remaining ones, like these are okay, you want to keep. And so in the case control study, you want to run pairwise IBD tests and remove all the, you know, all the ones that are like either, you know, offsprings, you know, related or twins, but keep those that are totally unrelated. Okay, so once you finish that, then the remaining ones are okay. But still, this is the conclusion from most of the GWAS studies that people found. So the x-axis is the allele frequency, which is how frequent this particular SNP appears in the genome. This is 10%. It's a pretty common allele. This is 1%, and this is pretty rare. And people recently are starting more and more to look at the rare ones. And the y-axis measures whether the penetrance is high. So high penetrance means if this person has that particular SNP, would they like 100% go to have the disease, then it's a high penetrance. But if this person have the SNP is only a slightly increased the chance of disease, then the penetrance would be low. Okay, so when people started to do the GWAS studies, they are hoping to get the low-hanging fruit. What's the low-hanging fruit is around here. So they are very common, and the penetrance is very high. Then you can find it, right? You know, if you, this means you don't need to profile many individuals. You will see enough cases of this SNP happening. And whenever this SNP happens, this person will have that disease. So early days, people were hoping that the GWAS is here. With deeper and deeper, more and more profiling, they found that most of the GWAS studies were identified like this. Because remember, early GWAS studies were just looking at SNPs. So SNPs have over 1% population percentage. So they're over 1% is, you know, reasonably common already. But their effect size are usually small. Their penetrance is low. But so you need to still profile bigger populations in order to see this. These are the Mendelian diseases. They appear extremely rare, but if they appear, the person definitely have that disease. So this is, you know, like the child, as soon as they are born, you see this problem. And you sequence the parents, you sequence child, very often you will find out it's that particular, it's like a mutation happened in the egg or the sperm, which caused the disease. Okay, so a lot of the Mendelian disease happen like this. But there are a lot of other ones that are, really, really hard. I would say, initially when people do GWAS, they're hoping this is the case, but then they found it's more like here, and now they are trying to also get those really less frequent and low penetrance ones, which is much, much harder. It means you have to profile hundreds of thousands of individuals or millions of individuals to find a little bit effect, which you have to wonder whether it's even worth all that money spent, right? Yeah, so over the years, NHGRI has collected all the published, so this is the map back in 2012. So NHGRI GWAS catalog continue to grow with each additional study. Basically, for each study submitted, this NHGRI website will collect all the SNPs that have 10 to the -8 p-value significance. So whatever study they collected again, another study collect again, and so all of this information is available from this GWAS catalog. Unfortunately, we don't have the information of the raw data, because if given a SNP, very often you can uniquely locate the person. There has been a study to show that if the SNP information, the genotype information is known, you will know who this person is. And if from the, like there are companies like 23andMe, you do a mouse swab, they will keep track of your SNPs and they can tell you, oh, seems like you have a family history of something, or you are more likely to get type 2 diabetes, or maybe Alzheimer's disease, and so on. So those information you may or may not want other people to know. For example, this might change your house insurance policy, right? So because of that, most of the GWAS studies do not give you the raw data of the genotyping. And so this actually makes our homework design much, much harder because we don't have raw data. Frankly, if you have the raw data, you just do a million chi-square tests. It's not that difficult. There are tools to do this, right? Instead, this GWAS catalog is just whatever study at the end, they will tell you this SNP has what's the p-value. If another SNP, what's the p-value. So you don't have the information for the individual's genotyping, right? So you only know out of this whole GWAS study in the population there, what's the p-value of each SNP. And so it is a very useful catalog, and people kind of use it to look at some disease and understand. Yes, Jet.
Does 23andMe like keep your information and do GWAS studies with it?
The question is whether 23andMe keep your SNP information. Yes. So when you do 23andMe, you not only you pay the money, you do the mouse swab. They also ask you to fill out a very comprehensive questionnaire of your, your height, your eye color, your hair color, or, and also your family history of some disease. Your parents' family, like a disease history, right? So they do definitely use those information. So when you do 23andMe, they will tell you, oh, recently there are more GWAS studies. Look like you're going to have this new disease, which is like, you don't want to know this. So first of all, most of what they found has a very small effect size. Say, you are 3% more likely to get a disease. Frankly, if you live healthy, sleep well, eat less, do more exercise, you can drastically change this at more than 3%. So the probability is pretty small. In addition, for a lot of the disease, there is very little you could do. Say if you're predicted to have brain cancer, what can you do? Not much, right? So there are some things you could do, like the double mastectomy, but some other disease, you just have to live healthy, but you should have lived healthy anyways. Yes, Michael. Daniel, sorry.
Sam.
I'm sorry.
So they only do like a SNP, right?
Yeah, so I think so far 23andMe is using the SNP arrays. That's how they can control their cost to be very, very low. But currently in academic or even pharmaceutical companies, they are doing whole genome or whole exome sequencing now, more and more the case.
Will they save samples from I know they retroactively tell you something new about SNPs they've tested. Can they go back and do more sequencing?
I'm not sure they do that. I think they, but they just kept their profiling information because data storage takes nothing, right? But I think sample storage does take some space and money. Yeah. Yes, Laura.
A little off topic from before, but do people ever do GWAS with different sample sizes for the same disease and then not look at the p-value, but just look at the direction of the effect or something? Because it seems like the problem of very large sample sizes giving significant results on people would be
so yeah, the question is whether there are multiple GWAS studies for the same disease with different cohorts, different population, and how people deal with that. There are a lot of meta studies like this all the time. Multiple studies on the same disease, they might find slightly different things, but then there you could look at, p-value, even lose p-value, at least to see whether the effect size is in the same direction. And sometimes you can combine all the studies together, or if there are population stratification, you say, oh, this is really a mostly Asian population. Then for the other cohort, we take the Asians out, right? Something like that. So you can look at those multiple studies and do meta-analysis and potentially get better results. And so in general, bigger populations, better design studies, you will get more SNPs. Okay, so, yes, Jed.
So you said that it's hard to get the raw data from this. Has anyone designed a study to try to merge these really big GWAS studies? It seems like there are a lot.
Yes, so questions, if the raw data is not given out, how can you do the meta-analysis? Yeah, usually the original study group, they do keep the original data. And so there are several of these big groups, like Broad or Sanger Institute, and they are usually the group who does all these meta-analysis between the different studies because they have the biggest sample size and say, oh, why don't we all work together, right? And you can do these analysis. Okay.